Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. It is Monday, March 8th, 2021. For those of you who might be new to the Evoke format, this is one of those ones where we take any questions that are on your mind, any live questions. We also take in pre-submitted questions during the week, and so there are a couple of those that we're going to start with, and then we'll get to your live questions. These can be any questions about therapy, about Evoke, about relationships, about psychology. These could be questions about your family or friends. This could be questions from your family and friends. And just to remind you, you can always invite your family and friends to these sessions so that they can ask questions. If you are a sibling or a child, or you're asking for on behalf of a sibling and a child, please submit the age along with your question, because obviously I'm going to answer the question very differently to a 10-year-old than I would to a 20-year-old. So that can be helpful. So with that, let's get right into the questions for this evening. And please submit your comments, questions at any time. And Malia will be passing those on to me, who's moderating for me this evening. Will be passing those on to me when time in the broadcast permits. So let's get to the first question. Somebody says, how would you help an 11-year-old girl to handle her feelings when others pick on her? I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and maybe I've said it over the last couple of broadcasts, but I think maybe a very great practical model for all of us is Mr. Rogers. If you didn't watch Mr. Rogers as a child, and I didn't, then I would encourage you to watch the documentary and the motion picture that came out. More than anything, to validate what it feels like is the most important thing. To understand what it is, to ask if she's looking for problem solving or solutions, but not to go to that too quickly. I saw an essay one time about Mr. Rogers, and somebody was commenting on somebody else's comments about Mr. Rogers, and the essay that I saw said, I know that's not how Mr. Rogers would have approached it, because Mr. Rogers would have never tried to talk a child out of their feelings. He would have welcomed them and talked about them. Mr. Rogers talks about big feelings and scary feelings and feelings that cause us to feel overwhelmed and hopeless and all kinds of various aspects of our feeling or our emotional world. So more than anything, validation, listening, co-regulating. We've talked about that some. I did a podcast on that a couple of months ago where you learn to not have to take your big feelings in regards to your children's big feelings and express them and sort them out somewhere else, so that if you respond to your child's big emotions with an upregulated a nervous system, meaning that you're anxious or upset, then they're learning they're learning something about those feelings from you by your own traumatic responses or upregulated responses. So listening, welcoming, relating as much as you can to validate. Move to solutions very, very, very slowly and very reluctantly. Because we want our children to move through feelings, we try to get them to move through feelings. Of course, the great irony in all of this is that people move through their feelings when they're allowed to feel them. And when they're encouraged to move through their feelings, they often stay stuck and fixed in that emotional response. So, and then lastly, I know I talked about this because Malia put both the links for the documentary and the motion picture up for us. Take a look at that, because he's a great model for a therapist, a very practical model for therapy and for parenting for all of us. And he was able to relate to the kids and speak to them, and really, I think, did a beautiful and sublime job at understanding and connecting to children in childhood. So those are my thoughts. Somebody writes, I'm hoping you can discuss boundaries and consequences. Are boundaries for protecting the person setting them, or to teach the other person something? Likewise, are consequences for protecting the person defining them, or to teach the other person something? Also, how does one set meaningful and effective, fair boundaries and consequences? It's a great question, and I think the definition of these things get kind of confusing. A boundary is your limits, your preferences, your likes, your dislikes, your requests. The more defined they are, absolute they are, of course, the stronger your feelings and preferences. Boundaries are about basically stating to the world, here's what I can and can't tolerate. Here's what I will and won't tolerate. Here's what I'm willing to do and not to do. Consequences come in relationships where we have kind of consequences for those boundaries. I'm not okay with you hitting me. If you hit me, I'll call the police, for example, just to use an example. The boundary is I'm not okay with you hitting me. I won't be in relationship with somebody who hits me. And the boundary of calling the police, or if it's a child throwing a tantrum, losing privileges or going in a timeout for some time, those are consequences. Consequences can also be positive and rewarding. So boundaries are essentially for self-care. The more primal or fundamental issue to boundaries is your truth, how you feel, what you think, what you believe, what you like, don't like, so forth. So first it's about self, defining and understanding yourself. Then it's about boundaries, what you can or can't or will or won't tolerate. And then the consequences as they relate. You wouldn't necessarily want consequences in relationships that aren't related to you in an intimate way. You wouldn't give consequences to the public, for example, go around doling out consequences. If somebody had a sign on their lawn that you disagreed with, you wouldn't go up to them and dispense a consequence for them, right? You might have a boundary, a belief about that sign that they have on their lawn, but you're not going to dispense consequences. So the other thing that comes out of this is that we don't set boundaries or establish boundaries to teach other people, but they do teach other people. I'm going to say that again. We don't establish or define or set boundaries to teach somebody a lesson, but people learn lessons from the boundaries we set. If they're our children or the people that we live with, they kind of learn where our limits are and learn what the consequences are of crossing those limits, those boundaries. So it's a strange kind of subtlety. You've heard the phrase, don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. It's actually a religious, originally in a religious context, that phrase. But it means that you set your boundaries and you realize the more you live and you speak your truth, you set boundaries, the more that your life, is organized in such a way that the people around you are treating you the way that you want to be treated. Because many of your boundaries are going to be non-negotiable. A boundary is not a preference, like I prefer adventure movies over sitcoms. Boundaries are I won't watch a horror movie, or I won't watch a movie where animals or children get hurt, for example. And if one comes up, I'll leave the room. A boundary and a consequence could be for your child is I'm not okay with you watching, to the young child, rated R movies. And if you do, you're going to lose some TV privileges. That's the consequence. So yes, boundaries teach, but that's not the purpose of them. They just do it intrinsically. Like I've said before, because this is a strange thing to say if you're new to these broadcasts, but this work is becoming more of who you are, more of yourself. And the more you become who you are, the more your children have to understand how to live and respect and tolerate and negotiate with another person. So part of the dynamic that coincides with children lacking empathy, not recognizing the consequences of their actions, part of the dynamic, part of the thing that coincides with that is parents who aren't demonstrating a sense of self. When I talk about it, I say entitlement and lack of empathy doesn't come from spoiling a child. That's kind of the behavior, but it's more related to when a parent doesn't know who they are, doesn't know what their boundaries are, because they grew up with parents who probably defined them for them. who didn't see it as the task of raising a child for that child to discover who they are. So the more you do therapy, the more you work, the more you go to Al-Anon or Coda, the more you find out who you are, what you're okay and what you're not okay with. The more you communicate that, the more you establish boundaries and consequences where they apply, the more the people around you change. They either adjust or they fall out of your life. You attract different kinds of people and you repel different kinds of people. And then your children or the people that live with you, especially your children, because they have no choice whether or not to live with you, they have to learn to operate with another person in mind. And that's a helpful process. So I hope that is not too abstract, but that's kind of the idea that I have from your question. Somebody writes, advice for getting to the root of why our son doesn't want to engage with us on our weekly phone calls. He was the same way in wilderness with very little letter writing back to us. When asked, he just says, I don't know, and it has become a hindrance to our progress with him. I love your instinct, first of all. Your instinct of being curious about why is a healthy, appropriate instinct. You know what to do about that? I would start taking guesses. I would float them out to the child. I mean, ultimately, you want him to be able to say to you, this is why I don't want to talk. It could be that he's not verbal, right? It could be the most benign reason he's not verbal. He's less social, right? He prefers to talk less. That's probably the most benign example. But somewhere in the middle, I suspect that there's some kind of cost for him if he expresses himself, or there has been some kind of cost for him in the past. It doesn't have to be just related to you, although it could be. It could be peers or teachers, right? Um, so I would stay curious. I would get curious. I would float ideas and hypotheses out there to him. I wouldn't put him in a corner. I wouldn't demand the answer to the question. I would assume that him not talking or his aversion is telling you something about his preferences. And then I think the last kind of stage of work in this area is finding out if you can still maintain what you need to maintain, your values, your boundaries, but honoring that he might have a different style of preference. I wouldn't push him into the right way of interacting with you. And I would even ask him about that. Have you felt pushed? Do you feel pressured? Do you feel like we're asking you to take care of us? I'm going to say something. We have a fairly good number in attendance this evening. So it's a good night to share such an extreme position as I'm about to share. And that is this. My favorite book about child development, The Drama of the Gifted Child, is, when I'm training therapists, what I say to them is read that book and understand it, because that's what's happening in the world. The idea that the child experiences the need to take care of the parent so that the child can feel okay. Because if a child, according to this psychology, this model, the drama of the gifted child, if a child is too much of a burden, too frustrating, too disappointing, too infuriating, and the list could go on, the child experiences this innate idea that if they are too much of those things and the parent has enough and ultimately abandons them, then the child won't survive. Quite literally, it's in our DNA. We are the most pathetic creature of virtually every animal, every species on Earth. We need the care and oversight of our parents virtually more than any other animal, maybe any other animal. The good news is it's related to our brain development. There's a long period of time of brain development that we now refer to as childhood, which is under the age of 25. In our society, we've demarcated it at around 18, which is arbitrary, but 25 until the adult brain comes into play. It allows our brain to prune itself, to grow, to adjust, to learn things more than other animals. So that's a little bit of a side note, but the point of it is that um, it's really important to understand what isn't spoken, to understand the psychology of the child, to understand why they might be quiet or rebellion. People mishear this all the time. When I talk about understanding children, it doesn't mean that you're a doormat, that you don't have boundaries. But you pair those boundaries and consequences with compassionate understanding. And you allow that understanding to inform you, but not rob you of your boundaries. I have parents all the time saying, well, if my child lashes out in anger and becomes verbally aggressive or violent with me, do I just tolerate it because I understand that it comes from trauma or pain? And my answer is, of course not. You don't have to do that. But your understanding can inform you about in terms of how to respond. You can still have firm, clear boundaries. In fact, people that are doing this work, the work that you're all doing, listening to these webinars, people that do this work are excellent at boundaries. People that don't do this work conflate boundaries with empathy. Their empathy compromises their ability to set boundaries. Because they understand or have compassion, they can't say no. They can't dispense a consequence, right? And oftentimes people sacrifice one for the other. All boundaries, or I should say too much boundaries, not enough empathy, or too much empathy at the cost of boundaries. This work is 100% boundaries, 100% empathy, right? That's the aspiration, to be very clear about my boundaries and to have an unending, compassionate perspective toward the people around me that are suffering and struggling. So, that's my answer, is get curious. Start floating some ideas out there. Ask questions. Don't put him in a corner. Don't force him to do it the right way. And don't assume that his lack of communication with you is a sign of a mental health issue. It could be, at least it is in his mind, a very appropriate and logical response to a situation that doesn't feel safe or okay to him. I think that's very important. And then lastly, the drama of the gifted child in my book, it's what's happening. It's what's happening. Not all the time, and there's more happening than just that, but it's what's happening. The child's ability to sense what the parent needs, behavior, feelings, thoughts, words. The child's ability, the gifted part of the child is the child's ability to sense what the parent needs, and then an inclination to give that to the parent at the cost of the authentic or the real self. And then that becomes a neurosis or a mental health issue over time. That's the idea. Somebody writes, I am curious about how to have conversations with our son when he makes poor choices. You encourage us not to judge, not share our feelings. Don't lecture. I find myself listening a lot to just repeating back what he says to me, empathizing but not getting much beyond that. Is there more that I can add to the conversation with him? I mean, you've kind of outlined it. Again, what we often try to do is we try to talk at the child, because if we can bring them around to our way of thinking, convince them, teach them up, right? Lecture effectively, win the debate, win the argument. If we do those things, we think then they'll behave the way that we want them to, and then we won't have to set boundaries. But as we parents grow up, we realize that the child's mind, the child's psyche isn't built that way. We have to make decisions and act from an adult place. We take into consideration all those things that I was just describing, but we don't impose it on the child tends to learn from what we do, but we don't try to convince them of what we think. Okay? And the most important thing that children are learning from us is not your doctrine, your values. Those come out too. But the thing that the children are learning about you is what it means to be a person and connected to another person. The thing that you cannot not teach your child is the idea of boundaries, where you and I start and stop in relation to each other. That's impossible not to pass on. How reactive to the child you are, how upregulated or anxious or frustrated or angry you get to a child's behavior, whether or not you make the child's behavior about you, whether or not the child's success and failures you see as a measure of your success and failures, on and on and on examples. That's what children are learning from us. And so when they go out in the world, they might marry somebody who looks like us, who has the same profession that we do, like some of the same hobbies, but that's not what we mean when we say you're going to marry your mother or your father. What we say is you're going to marry somebody who has about the same level of differentiation, the same level of boundaries. And while it might look different on the surface, stylistically, an angry person, a reactive, a person who's tending to shut down, is just as undifferentiated as a dependent person, right? They just have a stylistic difference in the way that they're displaying it. They learn about boundaries through you. They learn about separateness of self from you. They learn about the we and the I from you and how those two things overlap with each other or not. That's what they're learning from you. So you're trying to model for them in your boundaries, your listening, your empathizing, which are all healthy things. You're trying to model for them the sense of differentiation. And the arguing, the lecturing, the nagging, the pleading, the begging, the threatening, those are all emotionally coercive attempts to change a child's behavior. And they can be effective. That's the rub, is they can be very effective. But for children that are struggling with themselves, mental health issues, ego strength, they can also be very, very crushing and suffocating for them. And even the ones that become ultra compliant will suffer under the weight of all of those behaviors. My favorite book, and you probably know this, on the subject of boundaries is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. I think it says A Woman's Guide to Intimacy and Relationships, but I think it's just a person's guide to intimacy and relationships. The title's a little bit Both of my two favorite books to recommend, The Drama of the Gifted Child and The Dance of Anger, have titles that don't make sense on the surface. Once you read them and understand them, they make perfect sense. But if you're just flipping through them in a bookstore or on your computer, you're not going to recognize what's really being talked about there. But those are my favorite too. Somebody writes, after numerous years, my son, who's 25, is at a point to look for a job. He interviewed online recently and did not get the job offer. Do you think suggesting a job or a life coach would be a good idea? I think he came across too eager, almost desperate. Wouldn't be my inclination. Let him come to you and ask. I know that we were kind of taught, or we think that our role in parents is to have the answers. I mean, that's the thought. We think we're supposed to have the answers. And what we know about child development and child psychology is that doesn't, a parent with all the answers is not the ideal parent. A parent with curiosity and limitations and confusion and not knowing, but with clarity about their sense of self, that's the ideal parent. So, no, I wouldn't offer anything at all. I would be slow to offer suggestions or solutions. I would listen, I would empathize, let him kind of figure it out and roll it out. If he comes to you saying, do you have any ideas? Phrases like a life coach could be helpful, or I could get you in touch with somebody who does this professionally if you want it. Those can be helpful, but be really, really, really slow to give advice or solutions. The chapter in my book, The Audacity to Be You, and in it's also on our website. We have a podcast, The 8 Tools. You know, if it gets to a point where he's asking, Even then, I don't give advice. I just say, well, this could work. This could help. This might help you. You know, most of my, I mean, I hate to say this, but most of the stuff that I know that I hold to be of great value, I learned myself. I learned it in a context that was safe, but I learned it myself. Um, Advice threatens differentiation. Advice threatens the development of self. Advice suggests that you know the answer. So then they're going to start looking for the right answer outside of themselves all the time, and they won't know. And even those of you who have a deep practice, even a religious practice, for example, you want them to be able to discern for themselves the truth of things. Otherwise, while they're in your home, maybe they're going the direction you want, but then they'll end up with peers and partners that could easily lead them astray with certain techniques. So you want them to develop a level of discernment. I think no matter how um, strict your belief system is, an important part of this, which goes to the heart of developing a sense of who you are, you want your child to learn discernment and to practice making mistakes. It's important to practice making mistakes and to learn from them and to do it in a safe place. So, um, next question. I'll tell you one story just because I haven't told it in a long time. My son came to me. My son's 28 now, and this was when he was 18. He came to me and he said, I applied for a job. I think at a photographer's. My son's an artist, among other things. Um, and I said, "Oh, cool." I was getting ready in the bathroom, and he said, "I lied to them about when I'm going back to school. I told them it was going to be January, but it's really going to be August." And this was like May. And I could feel the bait. I could feel it. He knew me, and he was waiting there. And I said, "Oh, I wonder how that will go." He came back to me a few days later and he said, "I called them and I told them that I would be leaving in August. I told them the truth." And I said, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "My friend Josh told me I was being an idiot." And I thought, better that it come from him than from me. So you see, I think the instinct would be to teach your son right from wrong and honesty over deception. That's what most people would think. And you would find many people on the surface, um, few people to argue against that. But I was practicing at the time in the development of my son's life, giving him some rope and seeing what he would do with it. And then being for them if he got himself stuck, needed my emotional support. So somebody writes, what is the criteria for deciding how long our 18-year-old should be in the wilderness program and when is he ready to graduate from the program? That is an individual question. There are as many answers to that as there are individual clients. We're looking at progress to certain benchmarks. Okay. We're looking at about diminishing returns in terms of at 18 he can walk out, and so there's some kind of buy-in that we are paying attention to even with 18-year-olds. We're talking about how seriously threatening the behavior is that got him sent here, and so are we looking for a safety threshold? We're looking at aftercare, the next step, whatever that is, and have we found the right place and given him a chance to weigh in, to explore himself, and to make a choice. We're looking at his level of functioning when he came in compared to when he left. If he came in at a higher level of functioning, that's going to make a difference on the length of stay. So there's no one way to. This is a dialogue having with your therapist. And if you were my client or your son was my client, and you said on week 2, how long will my son be there and what's the criteria? I would start asking questions and I would start developing an idea around those several questions with you, in collaboration with you, about the next step for your son. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but it really is. There's no objective matrix. You can't look at here and in here and line them up and find out, that's 8 weeks. It's a dialogue. It's a relationship. It's time of the year. It's openings at the next program. I mean, you can start to see how the variables become a multitude of variables. So a dialogue with your therapist is the only way it can be accomplished. Somebody writes, how can I further support my kiddo, 16, on her mental wellness path when we can't even seem to get the medication right? Every change lands us in the hospital, four stays in the past 2.5 years, which is more traumatic as time goes on, other than Evoke. What can we do differently? Or we've been through several psychiatrists. How do we discern if medication is even more needed after or through wilderness therapy or an RTC? Well, I have compassion for the frustration and difficulty and pain I can sense in your question. You know, what I've learned about this being a therapist is that you listen to experts, but you can't advocate the decision for yourself, right? I think it's important to realize that if we're doing a good job, we're not telling you what to do in the first place. We're offering ideas and principles from which you can then make your own decisions. But therapists aren't perfect, and even the best ones make mistakes. And so my answer would be same with psychiatrists is I don't you got to find somebody who can have a discussion with you that you trust. Even with psychiatrists, which generically speaking, they have the least amount of training in mental health training. Okay? They're trained in the brain and they do one semester, one rotation in psychiatry. They're not trained like therapists and psychologists. It's not their craft. They're intervening medically, and so it's somebody who can can be asked lots of tough questions, can walk you through it. Somebody who's not perfectly sure of themselves, somebody who knows that it's an art more than a science, right? That it's trial and error. And the problem is that when you are intervening like with Evoke or therapeutic boarding schools or therapy, in science, when you're trying to isolate a variable and its effect on something, you don't change four variables at once. You change one at a time, and then you watch. And so if you're going through this process, Evoke therapy, therapeutic boarding schools, going off to college, moving, getting a new therapist, right? All those kinds of variables. You're changing too many variables to know what's making the change, how it's making an effect or having an effect on the person. So psychiatry is an art. It's based in science. It's an art. It's a dialogue. And the ones that I've respected are humble about it. And they see their job as creating a relationship with the parent in this case, or with the client if they're an adult, and working with them through it. And the best psychiatrist will tinker a little bit. And at the end of the day, as an adult, if you're the client, or as the parent of an adolescent, you have the right. If your therapist is so rigid, so sure of themselves, so absolutely clear on their position, you might want to get a new therapist or psychiatrist. But if they can work it through with you, tolerate your anxiety, your questions, you probably have a good therapist or a good psychiatrist in this case. So, and then I remember when I was reading my favorite book, The Drama of the Gifted Child, which I've already mentioned on this broadcast. I was reading it for the second or third or fourth time, and I was talking to my therapist, Jamie Gill. And I said I disagreed with this one part from Alice Miller, and she said, good. She said Alice would want you to find disagreement and to look at her work critically. In fact, the premise of her book is that she's not the expert with all the answers. She's the expert at describing a process, and you kind of find out where you fit and how you plug yourself into that process. And so Alice would support you in challenging her assumptions. And I think Jamie went on to say the book was written 150 years ago. she was exaggerating to make the point. It was written in the late 1970s, early 80s, but she's saying we learn. We've learned something since then. And you'll continue to learn. And later on, she said, you're going to write. She told me when I was writing my first book, she said, you're going to write several books and you're going to know more. These podcasts, these broadcasts aren't the same as they were 13, 14 years ago, right? I'm learning with you. And so, if you can't be a partner with a psychiatrist and there's not some deference to your discernment, then maybe find a new psychiatrist and try not changing so many variables at once. Those are my thoughts. Somebody says, good evening. My son, 17, has just entered the program, group 2 with Birgit. I am separated from his mother and in the process of divorce. She is a covert narcissist with undiagnosed BPD and possibly schizophrenia. What specifically can I do once he returns to facilitate growth and moving forward past the program? A lot of issue came back to her narcissistic wounds created within him. You're going to have to do your work, and you're going to have to do it consistently. If you want to go to free groups, you can go to these groups that we, by the end of every broadcast, I ask you all to go to some combination. We ask for 6, encourage you to try 6 of any variation of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children of Refuge Recovery. See, these groups don't give you tools and techniques about how to manipulate and control the situation. One of my favorite 12-step slogans is that the difference between me and God is God never thinks he's me. Okay? So these programs tell you how to be in relationship with people who are unhealthy, who are dealing with addictive disorders or dealing with self-sabotaging. So often we think about, especially in situations with a co-parent who's compromised like you're describing, I think from the best of places want to find what tools, techniques we can do to mitigate harm. And that's part of what brings you to this question. But my thoughts is you've got to stay focused on your side of the street and understanding how your side of the street, you might have to take legal steps, right? That's a possibility if it gets severe enough. But how can you interact in your system with somebody who's sabotaging the system and still have a positive effect on your child? I always say to parents that I hate questions about co-parents like this, because the reason I hate these questions is because I don't have a perfect answer for these questions. That you're always fighting a fight with one hand tied behind your back. Can you win a fight with one hand tied behind your back? Of course you can. It's going to be harder though. You're going to have to figure out how to work with one hand tied behind your back. So do your own work, do your own work, do your own work. Learn to intervene legally if you need to, but learn how not to become a part of the problem. Learn how to not contribute to a sick system of polarizations. I have a broadcast on co-parenting. Learn not that polarizations is kind of getting farther and farther apart from each other to compensate for each other. I'm going to practice more empathy and understanding and fewer boundaries because you're all boundaries and not enough empathy. So we get farther and farther and farther. So the teeter-totter stays balanced, right? It's hard work. I don't have a great answer, but it asks of you to be in therapy, to do your codependent work, to not get distracted by trying to fix the parent unless it gets, crosses a legal threshold. Somebody asks, my 12-year-old daughter's best friend killed herself 10 days ago. She cried when she found out, and since then has only said that she is mad at her friend for being so selfish. She won't talk about how sad she is feeling. She does not like to cry in front of people or share her feelings. Any ideas on how to best help her with her grief? This is a great question because you ask it in such a way that I can take it back to other principles that we've talked about. The answer to the question is meet her in her anger. Grief is like denial. Let me see if I get this right. Denial, bargaining, um, anger, something acceptance. What am I thinking of? Denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, maybe acceptance. I'm not sure. That's the original Kubler-Ross stages of grief. But what we know about grief is it kind of goes like this, backwards and forwards. And so you meet her where she's at, like Mr. Rogers. You don't try to get her to move through the grief. You try to meet her with the big feelings that she's feeling. And right now, for whatever reason, she needs to feel anger. I mean, that's part of our problem, right? As parents, is we have our own paradigm, our own way of living, and we impose that on the child. So the way to help her is to hear her, to understand her, to meet her where she's at, not to get her where ultimately as an adult she needs to go to be healthy and to integrate. It's tough. It's a very, very, very sad story, and the wall of anger that she's put up to protect herself from grief, or from what I imagine is a completely overmatched of existential anxieties for her as a 12-year-old that she doesn't have words for it. Grief is her best solution right now. So sit with her. Excuse me, anger is her best solution for her grief right now. So sit with her in that anger as long as she needs to sit there. And don't worry that she won't move through it in different phases. Just validate that it makes sense and sit with it. That's when other feelings will come up for her. Somebody writes, our child, 16 years, was at Evoke last spring, summer, and an RTC since the end of July. He keeps getting stuck on a certain issue. We have brought our best listening and validation skills to the issue, taken accountability and apologized for mistakes we've made, but have continued to hold a boundary on the issue. The issue has gone in cycles, thinking we've come to a place of peace or understanding only to rear its head again with more intensity. His narrative around the issue is fueled by incidents and stories he's voicing that are greatly exaggerated and in some cases outright false. We have validated and apologized for the parts that we can. We see how this behavior makes sense, but he has remained unwilling to hear another side or consider that we are not the evil, wicked enemies that he seems to need to cling to. We have all grown and have gained so much with our new communication skills, and yet he is still stuck around these stories. Any words of wisdom for us? I was thinking about something today about exaggerating. I heard somebody, I think I was listening to a book on tape while I was running some errands. I guess things aren't on tape anymore. I was listening to a digital copy of a book. And I was realizing that poets exaggerate, right? Poets exaggerate. Artists exaggerate. Writers exaggerate. Storytellers exaggerate. People exaggerate. And the reason that we exaggerate are a few things. One is to get the depth of our emotion across to the other person. That's one of the reasons. We say that you're my forever everything in a moment of rapture like love, to express the depth of our love and affection for somebody. So part of it is to communicate the depth of the feeling. Part of it is that we don't feel listened to. And so to justify our feeling, will exaggerate the circumstances because we feel like if we state them as plainly, the events as plainly as they occurred, that people will try to discount, to gaslight us in essence. But I talk about this in the book somewhere too, The Audacity of You. I say, listen to your children like they're telling you about their dreams. If you woke up and told me your dream, I wouldn't say to you, well, that's silly. Buses don't fly and dogs don't talk. I wouldn't pick apart the literal areas in your dream. I would say, what does it say about how you're feeling? How does the feeling from the dream mirror something that's going on in your life today? And then from that place, we would then interpret the symbols in your dream. So if you learned to listen to your child like they're telling you about your dreams, you can hear them. Because even their lies are telling some truth that they don't know how to, aren't willing to express. So you take all of this information and you hold it in your adult brain. And then you make adult decisions in your life, in the life of your children. And you don't tell them about your interpretation necessarily. You don't argue with the exaggerations. Your boundaries are clear. If you and I were in a relationship, a romantic relationship, we were married, and you told me versions of myself based on your subjective experience that I didn't agree with, my response, and I'm speaking in ideals now, my response was be to hear the feelings. I get it. You don't feel heard. Thanks for telling me, kind of things. But my boundaries aren't negotiated or compromised because of what you're saying. I don't have to do differently. I don't have to tolerate your drinking or your lying or your unfaithfulness or whatever it is that we're discussing. Your cruelty, your yelling, whatever it is. I don't have to change that. I can understand you and say, this is my boundary. Like I've talked about before, one of the secrets I have been offered that I'll pass on to you is in a lot of situations, I learned this from dealing with folks with borderline personality disorder. If you don't know what that is, you can look it up. But that you don't get to win, but you get to choose how to lose. And in this work, you don't get to be right anymore or win with your children. You get to choose how to be you and how to lose. But I think it goes back to we think that this is a winnable game. It's not. And by that, I mean you can't succeed all the time. You will dent your children, bruise them, make mistakes, be imperfect, not know yourself, slip up, fall, regress, so forth and so on. But you get to be a self. And that's way better than being right. And if you're married, you know what I'm talking about. You know the difference between being right and being in a relationship. So, yeah, it's a tough circumstance that you're describing for sure. So anyway, so you get to choose how to lose, but you don't get to win anymore. Once you surrender the idea that you can win or come out on top, you're just being you, and then your child gets to think that you're just a nincompoop, an idiot, whatever they think. But that's okay. They can grow up thinking that if they want to. But the boundaries around the behavior can be clear. Somebody says, "What is your hope? What is your hope?" I'm in an intensive rebirth of Al-Anon, your books, and my son's therapist at Crossroads suggestions, and I'm learning a new way to live where I'm not supposed, and most importantly, I do not want my son to be different from the way that he is. But I still believe that our salvation comes from a grace sent to us from God's through human relationships, and that makes us experience to be loved. And I hope this for my son. This is my hope. I don't have anything to say to that. That's beautiful. I would tell you that my book, the Audacity to Be You, learning to love your horrible rotten self. When I was playing with names, one of the early names I was going to call it On Human Being or Being Human, with the subtitle of what it means to be a person or a self or a human, what it means to be a self and love another. I mean, I think that's what we're all learning, right? Even our religious beliefs are trying to teach us what it means to be a person and to love another. And if you have a belief in a higher power that has offered you grace, that offers grace to the world, we know that there's no greater healing force in the world than grace, which is interesting because grace is kind of an undeserved love, right? And so, ironically, then we live our lives like we're trying to earn love, like we can become worthy of love, and that our children can earn a place at the table, so to speak. We tell them how to be because we were taught how to be, and if we're the right way, then we're worthy of love and connection and all these things. A great video, if you want to listen to it for the implications that it has to offer, is by Johan Hari. It's a 15-minute TED Talk. I think it was given in 2016 in the UK. Johan Hari, Hari. Everything we thought we knew about addiction is wrong, I believe is the name of it. Um, Basically, he's teaching this like addiction, mental health is a desperate cry for connection, not attention, but connection. And these drugs or these other unhealthy behaviors are they're kind of mutated, distorted attempts at connection. And so what you're all learning to do is to become a self, to become a person, and to love another, to be connected as it were. And in learning about connection, what it means to be a self and love another, you're providing your child with the cure, so to speak. Not that you can cure them, but you're providing them with the elements, with the recipe, with the model for living. So I would just say, I hear you, I'm with you. Somebody asked the question, how would you suggest I assist my son to get the most out of his therapy? He has just started seeing someone, and today he said he was trying to catch the therapist up on his life and stated he is not finding it helpful. He's not seeing him more than once a month. I suggested he speed date the therapist to get him up to speed. My son just said he does not have time. Just writing this tells me I need an Al-Anon meeting. This is my anxiety again. Perfect. I mean, therapy, it's like in essence, I mean, to kind of offer a silly analogy, it's like trying to tell your son how to date somebody and how to get the most out of it. You kind of have to wiggle your own way through that, don't you? I mean, I don't know anybody who's a bigger proponent of therapy than me. You all know, if you've listened, that I've been with Jamie Gill, my therapist, for 22 years, and been in therapy in various ways before that for another 10. Um, but you have to kind of discover it yourself. You have to develop your own relationship, and the chapter I wrote on adequate therapy, the two blogs on my website that talk about what to look for in a therapist and the myth of a guru therapist. Or if you Google my name, Brad Reedy, and my wife's name, Michelle Reedy, Brad and Michelle Reedy, and the title is Psychology versus Therapy. That's a more detailed and scholarly version of the blogs that I've written. It kind of talks about how therapy is something different than every other relationships. It's not your probation officer or your parent or your friend or your rabbi or your priest, right? It's not a police officer. It's not your partner, not your child. It's something different. And I don't think we have a lot of examples about how to make that work for us. So just support them, empathize, don't have answers. There's so much in this work that is benefited by us not having answers. There's so much, which is funny because I'm doing a podcast on question and answers for an hour every other podcast. But part of my method, as you know, is I don't know your truth. I'm working myself out. I'm trying to take my 10,000 hours. You know that phrase? 10,000 hours. I'm trying to take my 10,000 hours and share with you what I've gleaned from my 10,000 hours. But more than anything, I just want you to work on your 10,000 hours. I hope to give you glimpses of things, of ideas, but kind of have to work it out yourself. Somebody writes, our daughter 17 is very resentful of her brother 15, who went to wilderness and now is now in an aftercare program. How can we help mend their relationship with neither of them want to? We are not pushing either of them, but it saddens me that their relationship is so severed. They only have one another and no other siblings. I am hoping time will heal. I think I read in your question, your instincts are right on, which is you can't do anything except for the empathy and hold space for each one of them. But anything you do to try to, again, like we've talked about all night, to try to push for an outcome is often at odds with facilitating that outcome to come to pass. So the more you honor their defenses in response to each other, the more you ironically help them to move through their defenses, because they've created a defense around each other because there's hurt and unspoken pain. Back to the main theme of this and every other broadcast I ever do, make sure you're doing your work. It's really not our jobs to orchestrate anyone else's relationship with another person, right? I mean, you know that's in your question. You can be sad about it, but take your sadness somewhere else. Don't hand it to them. It's not their responsibility for you not to be sad. That is the essence of the drama, the gifted child. So take your sadness to your therapist, to your sponsor, to me here tonight, which you've just done, which I welcome and honor that you shared it with us. But don't give it to them. Don't lead them to believe that they have to do something so that you feel better. Because no matter how virtuous you are, if that becomes the project in their mind, then you're making them susceptible to other charismatic, powerful people in their life, or they'll follow and abandon themselves to please that other person. One last question before we wrap. I noticed that Naranon or Naranon families, is not included in your list of 12-step group. Why is that not included? No good reason. Any 12-step group. Naranon families is great. Naranon is great. Narcotics Anonymous, it's fine. Any combination of 6 12-step support groups that feel like when you go to one, ask other people there what ones they like. Tell them your circumstances and ask them if they know other ones that they recommend in your area. They'll often have some great suggestions for other meetings in your area. So there was no intention. I just didn't have an exhaustive list of 12-step groups. All right, folks. Couple of announcements. First of all, my books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. Also, the audiobook of The Audacity to Be You and My Voice is now out on Audible or Amazon. Also on your Apple devices, on your iBooks app. We ask everybody, if you want to do some deeper work, we have intensives. The March one is full. We have openings in April, and we have a couple of openings in our online March intensive, the 24th through 26th, excuse me. These are all a deep dive or a therapy accelerator of your own work. So if you're wanting to know your own work, your own background, your own history, how it relates to this, that's a place to go. We have pursuits trips for families and young adults between programs, 3 to 30 days of adventure/light therapy. For support groups, this week we have a wilderness current family and alumni support group on March 11th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And then if you are an intensives alumni, tomorrow, March 9th at 6 p.m., just email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. Like I said earlier, we ask all current parents to attend 6 12-step support groups, any combination of those. If you want to listen to these on your podcast app while you're driving, on the train, exercising, I don't know if I could take both. Self-help. I never did self-help while I was riding my bike or jogging. Didn't work for me. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You at Evoke Therapy Podcast, or you can go to soundcloud.com. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy, or on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Also, our Evoke Therapy blog has new information. There are I was contacted by the Evoke Family Foundation Board. They are asking for if people want to help join the board. They are redoing the board this year. You can just email me at brad@evoketherapy.com if you're interested. I'll pass on your information to them. And then I will be back on Monday. I'm going out to the field in Oregon for a couple of days. So I'll be in Oregon in the wilderness with the kids for the next couple of days. And then I'll be back next, I think it's Tuesday, right, Malia? Tuesday, the next one, where we'll be talking about chapter 4 of the Journey of the Heroic Parent. Am I getting all of that right, Malia? I didn't type it up for tonight, but I think that's right. At any rate, Malia will send out the invitation for the next broadcast. It'll go out tomorrow, and you can look at that. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I hope these questions are helpful. Have a great evening. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.